A black woman. A trailblazing CEO who built her empire from the ground up. Strides confidently toward her private jet. But what should have been a seamless moment of departure is disrupted when the pilot, blinded by prejudice, demands she prove she owns the aircraft. His tone is dismissive, his doubt unmistakable, and the humiliation is palpable. Moments later, her brother, a powerful figure in the aviation industry, makes one decisive call that changes everything. The pilot's actions result in instant consequences that send shockwaves through the company and ignite a broader conversation about accountability and respect. What follows is a story of resilience, power, and justice, proving that actions have consequences and change can start with one bold stand. Stay tuned, this is a moment you won't forget. Let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of empowerment and transformation resonate with you. Don't forget to subscribe for more impactful narratives. The city of Atlanta was waking up. The amber glow of the streetlights still clung stubbornly to the pavement as the first rays of sunlight began their slow march across the horizon. Inside a sleek, glass-walled office perched atop a high-rise, Aaliyah Monroe, a renowned entrepreneur and trailblazer, sipped her coffee in contemplative silence. The hum of the city below was a faint reminder of the world she had worked so tirelessly to shape, yet one that had never quite embraced her entirely. Her Cartier watch caught the light as she adjusted it, a gift from her late mentor, Ms. Eleanor Bryce. Every second matters, Eleanor had said when she fastened it on Aaliyah's wrist. A lifetime ago, it was a reminder that Aaliyah carried with her daily, especially on mornings like this, when the stakes felt impossibly high. The day ahead was a tightrope walk. 2 major meetings awaited her, one with investors in Chicago, the other back in Atlanta. Both demanded nothing short of perfection. Yet, the pressing business agenda was not the heaviest weight on her mind. There was also her mother's birthday dinner, a rare moment of familial warmth and connection in a life that often felt consumed by ambition. Carolyn Fisher, Aaliyah's steadfast assistant, entered the office, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The Chicago meeting's been moved up an hour, Carolyn announced with calm efficiency, handing Aaliyah a sleek leather folder. We need to leave in 30 minutes if we're going to make it. Aaliyah gave a curt nod, setting her coffee down. Is the jet ready? It is, Carolyn replied. Then, with a pause, your brother called. He wanted to remind you about tonight. The reminder hung in the air, its emotional weight heavier than Carolyn likely intended. Aaliyah nodded again, her jaw tightening as she pushed away the gnawing guilt of possibly missing another family milestone. The drive to the private airport was smooth, the city's streets still quiet in the early morning. Aaliyah sat in the back seat of her car, skimming through her notes for the presentation. But her focus was fractured, her thoughts darting between the expectations of her work and the subtle but persistent tension that came with being who she was, a black woman navigating the gilded corridors of power where she was often seen but not fully accepted. When they arrived at the airport, the familiar sight of her private jet, sleek and bathed in the soft light of dawn, came into view. The hum of its engines usually filled her with a sense of control and readiness. But today, something felt different. As Aaliyah and Carolyn approached the jet, a man in a crisp pilot's uniform stepped forward, blocking their path. His name tag read Richard Whitman, and his posture carried the easy arrogance of someone who believed he was untouchable. Good morning, Aaliyah said with her usual composed professionalism. I trust everything is ready for takeoff? Whitman's eyes flickered briefly over Aaliyah before settling on Carolyn, who he assumed, incorrectly, was the person in charge. Ma'am, he said to Carolyn, your jet is being refueled. We'll be ready in about 15 minutes. Carolyn blinked, momentarily thrown off. Actually, Aaliyah interrupted, her voice calm but firm. Mr. Whitman, I'm the owner of this jet. You can direct your updates to me. Whitman's expression barely shifted, though a flicker of disbelief crossed his face. He tilted his head slightly, as if studying her for the first time. You? He said, the single word laden with incredulity. Yes, Aaliyah replied, her tone unyielding. Is there a problem? Whitman hesitated, then plastered on a thin smile. Of course not, ma'am, he said, though his voice carried a subtle edge. I'll ensure everything is ready for you shortly. As he turned away, Aaliyah caught the faintest mutter under his breath. Typical. The word hung in the air like an accusation, slicing through the veneer of professionalism. Aaliyah felt the familiar sting of being reduced not to her achievements, not to her position, but to an assumption about her place in the world. "Let it go," Carolyn whispered, sensing the tension. But Aaliyah couldn't. It wasn't about her pride, it was about the principle. She had climbed too many mountains, fought too many battles, to let a moment like this go unchecked. As they boarded the jet, Aaliyah's mind raced. The anger simmered just beneath the surface, tempered only by the knowledge that this wasn't a new fight. It was the same fight she had been waging her entire life. The battle to be seen as worthy in a world that constantly questioned her right to exist in spaces of power and privilege. As the jet roared to life and ascended into the sky, Aaliyah stared out at the clouds, her thoughts churning. This was supposed to be another routine day in the life she had built from the ground up. Instead, it was becoming a confrontation with the invisible, insidious forces that still sought to box her in. And she knew, deep down, that this was only the beginning. The storm was coming, and she would need every ounce of her resolve to weather it. The jet sliced through the morning sky, the hum of its engines a steady backdrop to Aaliyah Monroe's restless thoughts. From her window seat, the clouds below stretched endlessly, a soft, indifferent expanse. Normally, she would have found solace in this. Flying had always been a metaphor for her journey, a triumph over the gravity of expectations that sought to keep her grounded. But today, her usual calm was replaced by a simmering discontent. Carolyn sat across from her, tablet in hand, scrolling through notes for the Chicago meeting. "The environmental initiative should be our lead," she said, her tone matter of fact. "It'll resonate with the investors. After all, they're looking for innovation." Aaliyah nodded absent-mindedly, her focus only partially on Carolyn's words. Her mind kept circling back to the encounter with Richard Whitman. The pilot, the casual dismissal, the subtle sneer. It wasn't new, but it was no less infuriating. She thought of the countless times she had faced moments like this. Moments that whispered, "You don't belong here. Are you okay?" Carolyn asked, breaking the silence. Aaliyah's eyes flicked to her assistant. She hesitated, then let out a soft sigh. "Do you ever feel like, no matter how high you climb, some people only see you as the girl at the bottom?" Carolyn's expression softened, her usually brisk demeanor giving way to a rare moment of vulnerability. "I do," she admitted, "but I also know that every step you take up that ladder forces them to look up." Aaliyah smiled faintly at the sentiment, but her heart felt heavier. The jet cabin, usually her sanctuary, now seemed smaller, more constricting. The plane landed smoothly in Chicago, and as they descended the stairs, the brisk wind carried with it the tension of the morning's confrontation. A black sedan waited on the tarmac, the driver holding the door open with practiced efficiency. Inside the car, Aaliyah reviewed the folder Carolyn handed her, the sharp clicks of Carolyn's typing filling the quiet. The meeting ahead was critical. Yet Aaliyah found her mind drifting again, this time to her brother, Marcus. She imagined him standing in his office, his voice steady and authoritative as he fielded calls with the airline's executives. Marcus had always been her shield, her advocate in battles she didn't even know were being fought on her behalf. But this wasn't a fight he could win for her. The car pulled up to the towering office building, its glass facade gleaming in the sunlight. The meeting room was already filled when they entered, the atmosphere charged with the unspoken stakes of the deal. Investors, mostly older white men, greeted her with perfunctory handshakes and guarded smiles. Their eyes flickered briefly over her, their polite expressions betraying a hint of skepticism. "They're already underestimating me," she thought, steeling herself. Aaliyah's presentation was flawless. Her voice was steady, her arguments compelling, her vision undeniable. The room began to shift as she spoke, the investors leaning forward, nodding in agreement. Yet, even in this moment of triumph, Aaliyah couldn't ignore the undercurrent. It wasn't just her words they were evaluating, it was her. The weight of proving herself, of being not just good but extraordinary, pressed down on her like a relentless tide. When the meeting ended, one of the investors, a man named Charles Whitaker, approached her. His handshake lingered just a second too long, his tone dripping with patronizing warmth. "Impressive presentation, Ms. Monroe," he said. "You've got quite the head on your shoulders. I must admit, I wasn't expecting this level of polish." Aaliyah's smile was polite, but her chest tightened. She had heard this before, in countless variations. "You're exceptional for someone like you." As they left the building, Carolyn broke the silence. "You crushed it in there," she said, her voice laced with pride. "Did I?" Aaliyah replied, her tone sharper than intended. She softened it almost immediately. "Sorry, it's just exhausting." Carolyn nodded. "It always is, but you're still here. That's what matters." Back on the tarmac, the jet gleamed under the afternoon sun. But the sight of Richard Whitman waiting near the stairs reignited the tension Aaliyah had been trying to suppress. He stood stiffly, his expression neutral, but his eyes betrayed a guarded defiance. "Ms. Monroe," he said, emphasizing her name in a way that felt almost mocking. "Your jet is ready for departure." "Thank you," Aaliyah replied evenly, her voice devoid of warmth. She caught a flicker of something in his eyes: resentment. Perhaps fear? It was hard to tell. As the engines roared to life and the jet lifted off, Aaliyah stared out at the horizon, the clouds now a restless sea of gray. She thought of Whitman, of Whitaker, of every subtle dismissal and overt challenge she had faced. The fight was never about one moment, one man, or one meeting. It was about the system, the invisible walls that hemmed her in. No matter how high she climbed. Carolyn's voice broke into her thoughts. "Marcus just texted. He's handling the situation with the airline." "Good," Aaliyah said, her voice resolute. "But this isn't just about Whitman. It's about what he represents." The jet began its descent, and Aaliyah felt the weight of the day settle heavily on her shoulders. The challenges ahead loomed larger than the city skyline outside her window. But as the plane touched down, she reminded herself of Eleanor's words, spoken so many years ago: "Every second matters. Every decision shapes your legacy." And Aaliyah Monroe was not about to let anyone or anything define her legacy for her. The air inside the jet was still, save for the gentle hum of the engines. Aaliyah Monroe sat in her seat, her fingers tracing the edge of the leather folder on her lap. From the outside, she appeared calm, poised, an image of unshakable authority. But within, her mind was a storm of emotions, the events of the day swirling into a tempest she could no longer ignore. Carolyn was busy tapping away on her tablet, finalizing notes for the next meeting. The faint clatter of her typing filled the silence. But Aaliyah barely registered it. Her thoughts were consumed by the encounter with Richard Whitman. It wasn't the words he had spoken, though those had been cutting enough, it was the tone. The unspoken weight of his disbelief. "You?" That single word echoed in her mind, sharp and dismissive, as though her success was an aberration that required explanation. She turned her gaze to the clouds outside, trying to steady herself, but the harder she tried to push the thought away, the more it clawed at her, demanding acknowledgement. This wasn't just about Whitman. It was about every subtle act of dismissal she had endured, every sideways glance, every loaded compliment that served as a reminder of the precariousness of her place in this world. "I should have said something more," Aaliyah muttered, half to herself. Carolyn looked up from her tablet, her brow furrowed. "You handled it," she said firmly. "You didn't owe him anything." "Did I?" Aaliyah countered, her voice tinged with frustration. "Because it feels like every time I let something like that slide, I'm complicit in it." Carolyn set the tablet down, her expression softening. "Aaliyah, you fight these battles every day. You can't carry the weight of all of it alone." Aaliyah sighed, leaning back in her seat. "Maybe not, but sometimes it feels like if I don't push back, nothing changes." Before Carolyn could respond, the jet's intercom crackled to life. "Ms. Monroe," Whitman's voice came through, clipped and professional. "We'll be landing shortly. Please prepare for descent." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. The sound of his voice reignited the simmering frustration she had worked so hard to tamp down. She could feel the unspoken disdain in his tone, the quiet assertion of his belief that she didn't belong here. It wasn't overt. It rarely was. That was what made it so insidious. The landing was smooth, the jet touching down with a grace that belied the tension simmering just beneath the surface. As Aaliyah and Carolyn disembarked, Whitman stood at the base of the stairs, his posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral. "Thank you," Aaliyah said curtly as she passed him, her voice measured but cold. Whitman's eyes flickered. A brief moment of something. Was it guilt? Resentment? Crossing his face before he turned away. The car waiting for them was a sleek black sedan, its driver holding the door open with practiced efficiency. Aaliyah slid into the backseat, the soft leather cool against her skin. Carolyn followed, her movements brisk as she began organizing their schedule for the rest of the day. But before the car could pull away, Aaliyah's phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "Call me ASAP. It's about the pilot." Her stomach tightened. She glanced at Carolyn, who was already pulling out her phone, her expression sharp with curiosity. "Something's happening," Aaliyah murmured, dialing Marcus's number. He answered on the second ring. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of urgency. "We need to talk about Whitman." "What about him?" she asked, her tone wary. "I spoke to the airline's CEO." Marcus began. "Apparently, this isn't the first time there have been complaints about him. They've been brushing it under the rug for years. But now, with your name attached to this, they can't ignore it anymore." Aaliyah felt her chest tighten. "What kind of complaints?" "Racially charged remarks. Dismissive behavior. You're not the first person he's disrespected," Marcus said, "but you might be the first with enough influence to do something about it." Aaliyah's grip on her phone tightened. "So what happens now?" "I've pushed them to launch an internal investigation," Marcus replied, "but it's going to take more than that. If we want real change, we're going to have to make this public." "Public?" Aaliyah repeated, her voice rising. The idea of airing her private humiliation for the world to see made her stomach churn. "I know it's a lot to ask," Marcus said gently, "but think about it. If you stay quiet, they'll bury this, just like they've buried every other complaint. But if you speak out, you could shine a light on something bigger than just this one man." Aaliyah didn't respond immediately. She stared out the window, the city skyline blurring past, her thoughts racing. She had spent her entire career fighting to be taken seriously, to prove that she belonged in spaces that weren't built for her. The idea of putting herself in the crosshairs, of exposing herself to scrutiny and backlash, was terrifying. But Marcus was right. This wasn't just about her. "I'll think about it," she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. "Take your time," Marcus replied, "but not too much. The longer we wait, the more they'll try to sweep this under the rug." As the call ended, Aaliyah leaned back in her seat, her mind racing. The fight ahead was daunting, but the alternative silence felt like a betrayal of everything she stood for. "Marcus wants to go public," she said, glancing at Carolyn. Carolyn's eyes widened. "Are you ready for that?" Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared out at the horizon, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. Finally, she spoke, her voice steady despite the storm brewing within her. "I don't know," she admitted, "but maybe it's time to stop letting them decide who gets to speak." The car pulled into the driveway of her next meeting, but Aaliyah's thoughts were far from the polished boardroom waiting for her. She wasn't just fighting for her place at the table anymore. She was fighting for the right of others to be there, too, and the battle was only just beginning. The day began to blur into a cycle of meetings, handshakes, and polite nods. For anyone looking at Aaliyah Monroe, it was business as usual. She carried herself with the effortless grace of someone who had mastered the art of navigating rooms where every word was weighed, every glance calculated. But beneath the surface, there was a quiet fury building, simmering just out of sight. By late afternoon, she found herself back at her office, staring at her reflection in the towering windows. The city sprawled out before her, a living, breathing entity, indifferent to the struggles that unfolded within it. She clenched her fists, the familiar frustration of being both visible and invisible gnawing at her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Carolyn. "They've responded," Carolyn said as she entered the room, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. "Who?" Aaliyah asked, though she already knew. "The airline," Carolyn replied. "They've issued a statement." Aaliyah reached for the folder, flipping it open with deliberate precision. The words on the page were sterile, crafted by legal teams and PR specialists. "We take these allegations seriously. We are committed to conducting a thorough review and ensuring our workplace reflects the highest standards of professionalism and respect." It was the kind of statement designed to say everything and nothing at once. "This is meaningless," Aaliyah said, her voice low but sharp. "It's a placeholder," Carolyn replied. "They're waiting to see what you'll do." Aaliyah let out a bitter laugh. "Of course they are. They're hoping I'll let it go." "Will you?" Carolyn asked, her tone careful. Aaliyah didn't answer immediately. Instead, she walked to her desk and picked up the Cartier watch she'd taken off earlier. She ran her fingers over its smooth surface, hearing Eleanor Bryce's voice in her mind. Every decision shapes your legacy. I don't know if I have a choice. Aaliyah said finally. If I stay quiet, nothing changes. But if I speak up, they'll come for you. Carolyn finished. Yes, Aaliyah said, her voice barely above a whisper. And not just me. They'll find ways to discredit everything I've built. The thought hung heavy between them. They both knew how the world worked. Women like Aaliyah were allowed in certain spaces only so long as they didn't make too much noise. Didn't challenge the status quo. To speak up was to risk everything. But the memory of Richard Widman's dismissive tone, the disbelief in his eyes, wouldn't let her rest. It wasn't just about him. It was about every microaggression, every closed door, every battle she'd fought to get to where she was. And it was about the people who would come after her, who deserved a world that didn't demand their silence in exchange for success. The decision was made. The next morning, Aaliyah called Marcus. His voice was steady, but she could sense his relief when she told him her plan. I'll draft the statement, Marcus said, but you'll need to be the one to deliver it. I know, Aaliyah replied, and I will. As they spoke, Carolyn began coordinating with a trusted PR team, ensuring the narrative would stay focused on systemic issues rather than descending into a personal attack. The goal wasn't to destroy Widman, it was to expose the culture that had allowed his behavior to thrive. By the afternoon, the statement was ready, and Aaliyah found herself sitting in front of a camera, the lights glaring down on her. The room was quiet except for the hum of equipment and Carolyn's whispered instructions to the crew. Aaliyah took a deep breath, her hands folded neatly in her lap. When the director signaled they were live, she began to speak. My name is Aaliyah Monroe, she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. For years, I've worked to build a career in spaces that were not designed for people like me. I've faced challenges that were not just about the work itself, but about who I am and who people believe I'm allowed to be. She paused, letting her words settle. Recently, I encountered a situation that reminded me of the insidious ways bias can manifest in our daily lives. It wasn't the first time, and I know it won't be the last. But this time, I'm speaking out not just for myself, but for everyone who has ever been dismissed, disrespected, or underestimated. Her voice grew firmer. This is not about one individual. It is about a system that normalizes exclusion and allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. It's about a culture that demands people of color, especially women, prove themselves over and over again in ways others are never asked to. And it's about time we change that. The statement was short but powerful. And when the cameras stopped rolling, the room was silent. You nailed it, Carolyn said softly. Aaliyah gave a small nod, though her heart felt heavy. She knew this was only the beginning. That evening, the video was released. It spread quickly, shared across social media, news outlets, and industry forums. The responses poured in, some supportive, others dismissive. Some people called her brave, while others accused her of playing the race card. The backlash came swiftly, as she had expected, but so did the support. Marcus called late that night. You're making waves, he said. The airline's board is meeting tomorrow. They know they can't ignore this anymore. Aaliyah leaned against her desk, exhaustion washing over her. Good, she said, but I need more than a meeting. I need real change. You'll get it, Marcus replied, but you'll have to fight for it. Aaliyah hung up, staring out at the city lights. The battle was far from over. But for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. The quiet fury that had fueled her for so long was now a roaring fire. And she was ready to use it to burn down the walls that had held her and so many others back. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. But tonight, Aaliyah allowed herself a moment of stillness, knowing that she had taken the first step towards something larger than herself. The morning after her statement was released, Aaliyah Monroe sat in her office, the weight of the previous day still pressing against her chest. The sunlight filtering through the window was deceptive. It gave the impression of calm, of normalcy. But nothing felt normal, not anymore. Carolyn walked in, tablet in hand, her expression unreadable. She placed the device on Aaliyah's desk without a word. The screen lit with notifications, emails, social media mentions, articles. The video had gone viral overnight. News outlets were dissecting her words. Panelists were debating her intentions. And her inbox was flooded with messages ranging from heartfelt support to thinly veiled threats. Have you read any of these? Carolyn asked, her voice carefully neutral. No, Aaliyah replied, "Not yet." Carolyn sighed, her usual brisk demeanor softening. "It's a lot, Aaliyah. Most of it is positive. But some of it is hard to read." Aaliyah nodded, steeling herself. She reached for the tablet and began scrolling. Messages of solidarity from strangers brought a brief smile to her lips, young women thanking her for her courage. Colleagues sharing their own stories of prejudice. Community leaders pledging their support. But then came the vitriol. "You're just playing the victim. This is why people like you shouldn't be in positions of power. Stop making everything about race." Each comment was a dagger. Small but sharp, aimed at her sense of purpose. She set the tablet down and took a deep breath. "You knew this would happen," Carolyn said gently. "You knew they'd try to twist this." "I did," Aaliyah admitted, "but knowing doesn't make it easier." The phone on her desk rang, its shrill tone cutting through the tension. Carolyn answered, her professionalism snapping back into place. Ms. Monroe's office. After a brief exchange, Carolyn handed the phone to Aaliyah. "It's Marcus." Aaliyah picked up the receiver. "What's the update?" "The airline's board just finished their meeting," Marcus said. His tone was measured but carried an undercurrent of urgency. "They've issued a formal apology and announced Whitman's suspension pending a full investigation." Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, her grip on the phone tightening. "Suspension? That's all?" "For now," Marcus replied. "It's a start. They're feeling the pressure. Your statement has them scrambling. And the media isn't letting up." "It's not enough," Aaliyah said firmly. "This isn't just about Whitman. It's about the culture that allowed him to act the way he did." "I know," Marcus said, "which is why we need to keep pushing. They've agreed to meet with you tomorrow. They want to discuss next steps." "Next steps," Aaliyah repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. "We'll see." The next day, Aaliyah found herself in the airline's headquarters, sitting in a sterile boardroom surrounded by executives. The air was heavy with tension, the kind that came from people unaccustomed to being challenged. At the head of the table sat the CEO, an older man named Thomas Grayson. His carefully crafted expression of concern betrayed no emotion. "Ms. Monroe," Grayson began, his voice smooth but distant, "let me start by saying how deeply we regret the incident you experienced. It does not reflect the values of this company." Aaliyah resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "With all due respect, Mr. Grayson, it does reflect your company's values. If it didn't, someone like Richard Whitman wouldn't have been able to act the way he did for as long as he did." Grayson's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. "We are committed to addressing these issues. That's why we've launched an internal review and are implementing new diversity training programs." "Training programs won't fix this," Aaliyah said, her voice rising slightly. "What you need is accountability. Not just for Whitman, but for everyone who enabled him. And you need to create opportunities for people who have been systematically excluded from this industry." Another executive, a middle-aged woman seated to Grayson's left, spoke up. "Ms. Monroe, these changes take time. We can't overhaul an entire system overnight." "No, you can't," Aaliyah agreed, "but you can start by taking real, meaningful action instead of hiding behind PR statements and half measures." The room fell silent. Aaliyah could feel the weight of their gazes. A mixture of defensiveness and begrudging respect. She had disrupted their carefully constructed world, and they didn't know how to respond. That evening, back in her office, Aaliyah felt the exhaustion of the day settle into her bones. She stared out at the city, its lights twinkling against the dark sky, a reminder of both its beauty and its indifference. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from Marcus. "They're scared. That means you're making progress. Keep going." She set the phone down and exhaled deeply. The fight was far from over, but she was beginning to see cracks in the facade. For the first time, it felt like real change might be possible. But with that possibility came a heavier burden. Aaliyah knew that the backlash would only grow, that the more she pushed, the harder the resistance would become. And yet, as she sat in the quiet of her office, she felt something stronger than fear: resolve. She thought of Eleanor Bryce, of the lessons she had learned under her mentor's guidance. Every second matters. Every decision shapes your legacy. And she thought of the people who had reached out to her, who were counting on her to keep going. The fault lines were beginning to shift, and Aaliyah Monroe was determined to see them break wide open. The morning began with an eerie quiet. Aaliyah Monroe sat at her kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea in her hands. The world outside was still waking. The hum of traffic faint and distant. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to savor the calm. But she knew it wouldn't last. The battle she had begun was now spiraling beyond her control. Her phone buzzed, its screen lighting up with a notification. Another article. Another headline. Corporate America faces reckoning after Monroe's statement. She skimmed the text, noting how the narrative was shifting. The story was no longer just about Richard Whitman or the airline, it was about the broader culture of systemic exclusion that had thrived unchecked for decades. Her tea sat untouched as she scrolled through her inbox. One message stood out. A colleague from years ago. "Thank you for speaking up. I stayed silent when it happened to me. And I've regretted it ever since. You're doing what so many of us were too afraid to do." Aaliyah's chest tightened. She felt the weight of those words. The quiet acknowledgement of shared pain. But along with it came an even heavier truth. She was now a symbol. Whether she wanted to be or not. The day's first meeting was a tense one. Marcus had arranged a conference call with the airline's leadership team, their lawyers, and a group of external consultants. The air was thick with formality. Every word carefully chosen. Every silence pregnant with meaning. "We've reviewed your suggestions, Ms. Monroe," began Thomas Grayson, the CEO, "and while we agree that systemic change is necessary, we must balance that with the practicalities of running a global organization." Aaliyah's voice was steady but sharp. "Mr. Grayson, the practicalities you're referring to are the very structures that perpetuate these problems. If you're not willing to dismantle them, then nothing will change." Another executive, a younger man with an air of discomfort, interjected, "We're not saying no to change. We're saying it's complicated. These issues are deeply ingrained. It's going to take time." Aaliyah leaned forward, her tone unyielding. "I understand that change is hard. But what's harder is the daily reality for the people who are excluded, dismissed, or demeaned by the culture you've allowed to thrive. Time isn't a luxury they have." The room fell silent. The resistance was palpable. But so was the growing sense of inevitability. They couldn't ignore her anymore. And that realization was both their burden and her power. By the afternoon, the backlash had escalated. Social media was alight with debates. Many of them ugly. Anonymous accounts spewed vitriol, questioning her qualifications, her intentions, even her humanity. Some of the comments were veiled in civility. Others brutally direct. Carolyn walked into Aaliyah's office. Her expression grim. "You should see this," she said, handing over her tablet. Aaliyah took it, her heart sinking as she read. One of the airline's senior executives had been caught on a hot mic during a private event, mocking her statement and dismissing her concerns as theatrics. "It's making the rounds," Carolyn said. "People are furious." Aaliyah set the tablet down, her mind racing. This wasn't just about one man's arrogance, it was a window into the culture she was fighting to change. But it also posed a question. How much more of this could she take? That evening, Aaliyah met with Marcus in his office. The walls were lined with books and framed certificates, a testament to his success. But tonight, he looked weary, his usual confidence tinged with concern. "They're pushing back harder than I expected," he admitted. "The board is split. Some of them want to do the bare minimum and ride out the storm." "And the others?" Aaliyah asked. "They're starting to see the bigger picture," Marcus said. "But they're scared. They know that real change means disrupting the system that made them successful." Aaliyah nodded, her jaw tightening. "They should be scared. Change isn't supposed to be comfortable." Marcus smiled faintly. "You've always been braver than me." "No," Aaliyah replied. "I've just had more practice being uncomfortable." The tipping point came later that night. Aaliyah was preparing to leave the office when her phone rang. It was Carolyn, her voice trembling with urgency. "You need to see this," she said. Aaliyah opened the link Carolyn sent. It was a leaked video. One that showed Richard Whitman in a bar, surrounded by colleagues. He was drunk, laughing as he recounted the incident on the tarmac. His words were cruel, dismissive, dripping with contempt. "I mean, come on," he slurred. "She's just another one of them trying to play CEO. They don't belong in our world. Never have, never will." The video was less than 2 minutes long. But it was enough. Enough to confirm what Aaliyah had always known. This wasn't just about one man's prejudice. It was about an entire culture that had normalized it. The next morning, the world exploded. The video was everywhere, dominating headlines and news cycles. Public outrage reached a fever pitch. Activists called for boycotts. Employees at the airline began speaking out. And the board was forced to schedule an emergency meeting. Aaliyah sat in her office, watching it all unfold. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. The walls were beginning to crack. But she also knew that the fight was far from over. The system wouldn't collapse on its own, it would have to be dismantled piece by piece. Carolyn walked in, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. "They're calling it the Monroe Movement," she said, handing Aaliyah a newspaper. The headline read, "Aaliyah Monroe takes on corporate America and wins." Aaliyah smiled faintly, but her resolve remained steady. "It's not a win," she said, "not yet, but it's a start." As she stared out at the city, her mind turned to the battles still ahead. The tipping point had been reached. But the real work, the rebuilding, was only just beginning. The rain was relentless that morning. A steady downpour that drummed against the windows of Aaliyah Monroe's office. She sat at her desk, watching droplets race each other down the glass, her thoughts a storm of their own. The leaked video of Richard Whitman had ignited a firestorm, but with it came a new level of scrutiny. Every decision she made, every word she spoke, was now dissected and debated. It was no longer just about her fight, it was about a system cracking under pressure. Desperate to maintain its facade, Carolyn entered without knocking, her usual briskness replaced with a tense energy. "The board's emergency meeting starts in an hour," she said, setting a folder on Aaliyah's desk. "They've invited you to join." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. "Invited? Or summoned?" Carolyn smirked faintly. "Depends on how you look at it." Flipping open the folder, Aaliyah scanned the agenda. It was the usual corporate jargon: review of internal protocols, discussion of public response strategies. But the subtext was clear: damage control. They weren't ready to dismantle the system, they just wanted to patch the cracks. "They're scared," Carolyn continued. "The backlash is hitting harder than they expected. Employees are organizing, customers are canceling flights, even a few shareholders are threatening to pull out." Aaliyah leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled beneath her chin. "Good, let them be scared." Carolyn hesitated, then spoke softly. "This is a big moment. Aaliyah, they'll try to placate you. Offer surface-level reforms to make it all go away. I won't let them," Aaliyah said firmly. "They wanted a seat at the table for this meeting? Fine, but they're going to hear the truth." An hour later, Aaliyah walked into the boardroom. The tension was palpable. The room filled with the hum of quiet conversations that abruptly ceased when she entered. At the head of the table sat Thomas Grayson. His usual composure strained. His smile was tight, his hands clasped on the table as though to steady himself. "Ms. Monroe," he said, gesturing to an empty seat. "Thank you for joining us." Aaliyah took her seat, her expression calm but unyielding. "I assume we're here to discuss what's next." Grayson nodded, glancing at his colleagues. "The situation has escalated rapidly. We're facing significant backlash, both internally and externally. We've already implemented temporary measures suspending Mr. Whitman, announcing a full review, but we need to address the larger narrative." Aaliyah tilted her head slightly. "The larger narrative? You mean the truth?" Grayson's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Instead, another board member, a woman with sharp features and a polished demeanor, spoke up. "We understand your concerns, Ms. Monroe," she said, "and we're committed to making changes. But we need to be realistic. Overhauling an entire corporate culture isn't something that happens overnight." "No, it isn't," Aaliyah agreed, "but using that as an excuse to avoid meaningful action is exactly why we're in this mess." The woman bristled, but Aaliyah didn't back down. She turned her gaze to Grayson. "This isn't just about Whitman. It's about the culture that allowed him to act the way he did without consequences. It's about every employee who has been dismissed, undermined, or silenced because they didn't fit your mold. If you want to fix this, you have to start by admitting that the problem isn't just a few bad actors, it's the system itself." Grayson sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "And what do you propose, Ms. Monroe?" Aaliyah leaned forward, her voice firm. "Start with transparency. Release the findings of your internal review to the public. Commit to independent oversight, so employees feel safe reporting misconduct without fear of retaliation. And establish pathways for underrepresented groups to enter and advance within this industry." The room fell silent. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. while others stared at Aaliyah with a mixture of apprehension and respect. "Those are ambitious goals," Grayson said finally. "They're necessary goals," Aaliyah replied. The meeting stretched on, the tension building as Aaliyah pushed back against every attempt to dilute her proposals. By the time she left, the rain had stopped, but the air was thick with the weight of what had transpired. Outside, Carolyn was waiting by the car. "How'd it go?" she asked as Aaliyah approached. "They're not ready to commit," Aaliyah said, sliding into the backseat. "But the pressure's building. They can't ignore this forever." Carolyn nodded, her expression thoughtful. "You're shifting the conversation, Aaliyah. That's not nothing." By the evening, the fallout from the board meeting was already making waves. Employees had begun staging walkouts, their demands echoing Aaliyah's proposals. On social media, the leaked video of Whitman was joined by new testimonies from airline staff, each one painting a damning picture of a toxic culture. Aaliyah sat in her living room, scrolling through the headlines. One in particular caught her eye. "Monroe Movement Sparks Nationwide Reckoning in Corporate America." It was accompanied by a photo of her at the boardroom table, her expression resolute. Her phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "They're going to fight harder now. Be ready." Aaliyah exhaled deeply, the weight of the day settling over her. She thought of Eleanor Bryce, her late mentor, and the lessons she had imparted. Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to keep going despite it. As the city lights twinkled outside her window, Aaliyah knew the fight was far from over. But she also knew that the cracks in the system were growing wider. And if she had to, she would break them open herself. The sky outside Aaliyah Monroe's office was an ominous gray. The kind of gray that threatened a storm but never quite delivered. Inside, the air was just as heavy, thick with the tension of a moment poised on the edge of transformation or collapse. Aaliyah paced by the window, her phone buzzing incessantly on her desk. Each notification was a reminder of how much the stakes had risen, how much more there was to lose. "People are walking out," Carolyn said as she entered the room. Her voice hurried. She carried a stack of printed articles, each headline more incendiary than the last. "Employees demand accountability after Monroe's call to action." "Corporate culture under siege. Is the airline industry ready for change?" "They're holding demonstrations in 5 major airports," Carolyn continued. LAX, O'Hare, JFK employees are refusing to work until the airline commits to concrete reforms. Aaliyah stopped pacing, her gaze sharp. "And the airline? What are they saying?" Carolyn hesitated, glancing at one of the articles. "Officially, they're expressing support for employee concerns and promising to listen. But behind the scenes," she trailed off, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Spit it out, Carolyn," Aaliyah said, her voice tinged with frustration. "They're trying to discredit you," Carolyn admitted, "leaking rumors to the press, framing you as a disruptor who's hurting the company more than helping." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. "Of course they are. They're scared," Carolyn said quickly, as if that would soften the blow. "But they're also doubling down. They've hired a PR firm to manage the narrative." Aaliyah turned back to the window, her reflection staring back at her. She wasn't surprised. The system was never going to crumble quietly. It would fight tooth and nail to protect itself, to silence voices like hers. The next call came from Marcus. His voice was calm, but Aaliyah could sense the urgency beneath his words. "They're holding an emergency press conference," he said. "Grayson is planning to announce new initiatives." "Let me guess," Aaliyah said bitterly. "Window dressing, just enough to make it look like they're doing something." "Exactly," Marcus replied. "But they're also going to paint you as unreasonable. A radical who's demanding too much. Too fast." Aaliyah clenched her fists. Radical. They love that word, don't they? It's how they dismiss anyone who wants more than scraps. Marcus's voice softened. "You need to be ready, Aaliyah. They're trying to undermine your credibility. But you have the truth on your side. Don't let them twist this." The press conference unfolded exactly as Aaliyah had anticipated. She watched it from her office, the screen casting a cold blue glow across the room. Thomas Grayson stood at the podium, his expression carefully composed. "We take these concerns seriously," he said, his voice measured, "and we are committed to fostering an inclusive and equitable workplace. To that end, we are launching a new initiative focused on diversity and inclusion training, as well as a review of our internal practices." It was the same script she had seen play out countless times before. Promises without substance, gestures without accountability. But then, Grayson's tone shifted. Unfortunately, he continued, some of the recent criticisms have been based on misinformation. While we respect Ms. Monroe's passion for change, we believe that real progress requires collaboration, not division. Aaliyah's chest tightened. Division, another weaponized word, a way to shift the blame onto her, to frame her as the problem rather than the solution. Carolyn turned to her, her expression tense. They're setting the stage to push you out. They're trying to scare me, Aaliyah said, her voice steady despite the storm building inside her. It won't work. That evening, Aaliyah received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Thank you for speaking up." It was from a flight attendant named Maria Alvarez, who had been with the airline for over a decade. Ms. Monroe, the email began, I watched your statement, and for the first time in years, I felt seen. I've worked here for 12 years. And I can't count the number of times I've been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel like I didn't belong. What you're doing matters. Please don't stop. Aaliyah read the email twice, her chest tightening with a mix of gratitude and anger. Maria's story wasn't unique, it was a reflection of the very system Aaliyah was fighting to dismantle. And it was a reminder of why she couldn't back down, no matter how much they tried to silence her. The next day, the demonstrations escalated. Employees began sharing their stories on social media, their voices amplified by hashtags and viral posts. Videos of workers describing years of mistreatment and neglect spread like wildfire, each one adding fuel to the growing movement. Aaliyah spent the morning meeting with employee representatives, listening as they recounted their experiences. Some were angry, others heartbroken, but all of them shared a common determination. They wanted change. And they wanted it now. We're not going back to the way things were, one worker said, her voice trembling with emotion. We've been quiet for too long. Aaliyah nodded, her resolve hardening. Neither am I. By the afternoon, the airline's headquarters was surrounded by protesters. Employees, customers, activists, people from all walks of life had gathered, their chants echoing through the air. The energy was electric, a palpable force that seemed to shake the very foundation of the building. Inside, the board was in chaos. Marcus, who had managed to gain a seat at the table, called Aaliyah with an update. They're panicking, he said. Grayson wants to issue another statement, but half the board thinks it'll just make things worse. They don't know how to handle this. Good, Aaliyah replied. Let them feel the pressure. As night fell, Aaliyah stood on the balcony of her apartment. The city stretched out before her. The day had been a whirlwind, a blur of meetings, protests, and calls. But through it all, one thing had become clear: the system was cracking. And for the first time, it felt like those cracks might actually lead to something greater. Her phone buzzed. It was another email, this time from an executive at a competing airline. The subject line read, "Let's talk." Aaliyah opened it, her eyes scanning the text. The executive wanted to discuss implementing reforms in their own company. Inspired by the movement she had ignited, she set the phone down, a small smile tugging at her lips. The fight was far from over, but the ripple effects were already spreading. Change was no longer a distant hope, it was a force moving through the air. Unstoppable and undeniable. And Aaliyah Monroe was ready to see it through. The morning light filtered through the clouds, casting a muted glow over the city. Aaliyah Monroe stood in her office, staring out at the streets below, where a growing crowd of protesters had gathered. Their chants echoed faintly even through the thick glass of the high rise. A reminder of the storm she had unleashed. Carolyn entered, her usual composure fraying at the edges. She held a stack of papers in one hand and a tablet in the other, her expression grim. It's getting worse, she said, setting the documents on the desk. The board's panicking. They've scheduled another emergency meeting for this afternoon. Aaliyah turned from the window, her face calm but her eyes sharp. What's their plan this time? Another half-hearted statement? They don't know, Carolyn admitted. Grayson's losing his grip. Half the board wants to push forward with reforms, but the other half is digging in their heels. They think if they wait long enough, the protests will die down. They won't, Aaliyah said firmly. People are tired of waiting. Carolyn hesitated before speaking again. The rumors about you, they're gaining traction. Some of the media outlets are running stories questioning your qualifications, your motives. It's ugly. Aaliyah felt a flicker of anger but tamped it down. Let them talk. They're afraid. And this is all they have left: distraction and deflection. Carolyn nodded, though her expression remained troubled. You're handling this better than most people would. I don't have a choice. Aaliyah said, this fight isn't about me. It never was. By midday, the tension inside the airline's headquarters was palpable. Aaliyah arrived for the emergency board meeting, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she strode through the lobby. Protesters outside pressed against the barriers, their signs a sea of demands: accountability now. End systemic racism. Justice for all. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was no less charged. The air crackled with unspoken animosity as the executives filed in, their faces a mix of frustration and unease. Thomas Grayson sat at the head of the table, his usual composure cracking under the weight of the moment. We need to regain control of the narrative. Grayson began, his voice strained. The protests, the media coverage, it's spiraling out of control. We're losing public trust, and our shareholders are getting nervous. Aaliyah leaned forward, her gaze piercing. You're losing public trust because you're more concerned with appearances than accountability. If you want to regain control, start by doing the right thing. And what exactly does that look like? One board member snapped, his tone defensive. You want us to overhaul the entire company overnight? That's not realistic. What's not realistic? Aaliyah countered, her voice rising, is expecting the people you've marginalized to wait patiently while you decide whether their lives and livelihoods matter. Change doesn't wait for convenience. The room fell silent, the weight of her words settling heavily over the table. Another board member, a woman who had been quiet until now, spoke up. She's right. We've been reactive when we should have been proactive. The longer we resist, the worse this is going to get for everyone. Grayson sighed, his shoulders sagging. What do you propose, Ms. Monroe? Aaliyah took a deep breath, steadying herself. Start by admitting the full scope of the problem. Conduct an independent audit of your practices, and release the findings to the public. Establish a task force to implement real reforms, not just surface-level changes. And commit to creating pathways for underrepresented groups to advance within this company. That's a lot to take on. Another executive muttered. It's what's necessary. Aaliyah said, anything less is just a band-aid. As the meeting adjourned, Aaliyah left the boardroom feeling the tension between progress and resistance. Outside, the protesters' chants grew louder, their voices a reminder of the stakes. The fight wasn't just about policies or statements, it was about lives. About dignity. About the future. Carolyn met her in the lobby, her face a mixture of relief and urgency. You did it, she said. They've agreed to the audit and the task force. It's a start, Aaliyah said, her voice measured, but we're not done yet. As they exited the building, the crowd erupted into cheers. Aaliyah paused, looking out at the sea of faces. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of what they had accomplished and the enormity of what still lay ahead. That evening, Aaliyah returned to her apartment, exhaustion settling over her like a heavy blanket. She sank into the couch, her mind replaying the day's events. Her phone buzzed with messages of support, but also with new threats and accusations. The opposition was growing louder, more desperate. Aaliyah stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to respond, to defend herself, but she knew it would only feed the fire. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, reminding herself of why she had started this fight in the first place. It wasn't about silencing the critics or proving them wrong. It was about giving voice to the people who had been silenced for too long. It was about breaking the cycle, even if it meant enduring the backlash. As she opened her eyes, her resolve hardened. The storm was far from over, but Aaliyah Monroe was ready to weather it. The system was breaking, its cracks widening with every voice that joined the call for change. And she would see it through no matter the cost. The morning broke with the city shrouded in an unsettling quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Aaliyah Monroe sat in her office, staring at the glowing horizon beyond the skyline. The stillness was deceptive outside. The storm she had ignited was reaching a fever pitch. Her phone buzzed incessantly on the desk, each notification a reminder that the battle had escalated. Protesters were growing louder, news outlets were dissecting every move, and within the airline, factions were forming. Some employees championed her cause, while others, emboldened by the company's resistance, whispered their disdain in break rooms and hallways. Carolyn entered, her expression taut with urgency. "The independent audit has started," she said, placing a stack of documents on the desk. "But the backlash, it's worse than we thought." Aaliyah leaned forward, her elbows resting on the desk. "What now?" Carolyn hesitated, then pulled out her tablet. "Internal emails have been leaked. Executives discussing ways to minimize the impact of your demand strategies to downplay the movement. Deflect attention. They're calling you divisive, accusing you of destabilizing the company." Aaliyah exhaled sharply, her jaw tightening. "Of course they are. When all else fails, attack the person forcing you to confront the truth." "It's more than that," Carolyn said, her voice lowering. "They're trying to position you as a liability, someone who's hurting employees by pushing too hard. Too fast." The weight of the accusation settled heavily in the room. It wasn't just an attack on her, it was an attempt to undermine the movement itself. To pit her against the very people she was fighting for. Later that morning, Aaliyah met with Marcus at his office. He looked as weary as she felt. The strain of the last few weeks etched into his face. "They're scared," Marcus said, pacing in front of his desk. "But fear makes them dangerous. They're not just playing defense anymore, they're going on the offensive. They're trying to destroy my credibility." Aaliyah said flatly. "Yes," Marcus admitted, "but you have leverage. The audit is uncovering things they hoped would stay buried: discrimination complaints, pay disparities, promotion gaps. It's all coming to light. And they'll fight harder to bury it again." Aaliyah said, "This isn't just about saving their image. It's about preserving a system that benefits them." Marcus stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression resolute. "Then we keep going. We make it impossible for them to hide." By midday, the protests outside the airline's headquarters had swelled. Employees were joined by activists, community leaders, and even a few politicians. The air was electric with chants and speeches. The crowd a living embodiment of the change Aaliyah had been fighting for. Inside, the board was in chaos. The leaked emails had been published by a major news outlet, and the fallout was immediate. Grayson's carefully constructed facade of control was crumbling, and the boardroom was filled with accusations and blame. "We need to release a statement," one executive said, his voice strained. "Denounce the leaks. Double down on our commitment to transparency." "Transparency?" another board member snapped. "The leaks prove we've been anything but transparent. If we don't own this, it'll destroy us." Grayson slammed his hand on the table, silencing the room. "Enough," he said, his voice cold. "We're not going to let her dictate the narrative." The room fell silent, the tension thick and oppressive. That evening, Aaliyah found herself at a community forum, surrounded by supporters and skeptics alike. The room was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. She stood at the front, her heart pounding as she prepared to speak. When she stepped up to the microphone, the crowd fell silent. She looked out at the faces before her, young and old, hopeful and wary, and took a deep breath. "This isn't just about one company," she began, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a culture that has normalized exclusion, that has justified inequity under the guise of tradition. It's about the systems we've been told are too big to change, too entrenched to challenge." Her voice grew stronger. "But those systems are built on the choices we make every day. The choice to stay silent, or to speak out. The choice to protect the status quo, or to demand better. Change doesn't happen because it's convenient. It happens because people like you and me decide it's worth fighting for." The room erupted into applause, the energy a palpable force. But Aaliyah knew the real fight wasn't in this room, it was in the boardrooms. The headlines, the hearts and minds of people still clinging to the old ways. As she left the forum, her phone buzzed with a text from Carolyn. "Grayson wants a meeting tomorrow morning. Says it's urgent." Aaliyah stared at the screen, her mind racing. She knew this wasn't a concession, it was a calculation. Grayson was fighting to regain control, to contain the damage. But Aaliyah also knew she had the momentum, the truth on her side. The storm was reaching its peak, and the system was beginning to buckle under the weight of its own contradictions. As Aaliyah stared out at the city, the lights flickering against the night sky, she felt a surge of resolve. This was the moment she had been preparing for. The breaking wave was coming, and Aaliyah Monroe was ready to stand firm. The early morning sun pierced through the heavy clouds, casting long shadows across the city. Aaliyah Monroe sat in the back seat of the car, her hands resting in her lap as she mentally prepared for the meeting with Thomas Grayson. The streets blurred past her window, but her thoughts were sharp and focused. Today wasn't just another confrontation, it was a reckoning. Carolyn sat beside her, her tablet glowing with the latest updates. The audit findings were leaked last night, she said, her voice quiet but steady. The numbers are damning. Pay disparities, promotions denied, a staggering number of complaints swept under the rug. Aaliyah turned to her, her brow furrowing. What's the public reaction? It's exactly what you'd expect. Carolyn replied. Outrage. Demands for accountability. The protests are bigger than ever. Employees from other companies are joining in, calling for audits at their own workplaces. Aaliyah nodded, her lips pressing into a thin line. This is bigger than the airline now. It always was, Carolyn said, her voice softening, but you're the one who made it impossible to ignore. When Aaliyah entered the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Grayson sat at the head of the table, his face drawn and his usually confident demeanor replaced by visible strain. The other board members were already seated, their expressions a mix of frustration, resignation, and fear. Ms. Monroe, Grayson said, rising briefly from his seat before sitting back down. Thank you for coming. Aaliyah took her seat at the opposite end of the table, her movements deliberate. Let's get to it. Grayson cleared his throat, his eyes darting to the stack of papers in front of him. As you're aware, the audit findings have been made public. The backlash has been significant. That's an understatement, Aaliyah said, her tone sharp. The findings confirm what employees have been saying for years. The culture you've cultivated here isn't just flawed, it's broken. Grayson flinched but quickly regained his composure. We acknowledge the issues, and we're committed to addressing them. That's why we've asked you here to discuss how we can move forward. Aaliyah leaned forward, her gaze unwavering. Moving forward requires more than empty promises. It requires dismantling the systems that allowed these issues to persist. You can't just change the narrative, you have to change the reality. One of the board members, a man who had been quiet until now, spoke up. And how exactly do you propose we do that? Overhauling an entire company isn't something we can do overnight. No, it's not, Aaliyah said, but you can start by taking immediate, concrete actions. Establish an independent oversight committee. Set measurable goals for diversity and inclusion at every level of the company. And ensure that every complaint is taken seriously, with real consequences for those who violate policies. Another board member scoffed. And how do you suggest we pay for all of this? The company's already facing financial pressure from the protests and cancellations. Aaliyah's eyes narrowed. You're asking the wrong question. The cost of doing nothing is far greater. If you don't address this now, your employees, your customers, and your shareholders will leave, and they won't come back. The room fell silent, the weight of her words sinking in. Grayson shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his gaze fixed on the table. The meeting stretched on for hours, the tension rising with every passing minute. The board pushed back on every proposal, their fear of change clashing with the undeniable urgency of the moment. But Aaliyah held her ground, countering their resistance with facts, stories, and an unyielding resolve. By the time the meeting ended, the board had reluctantly agreed to implement her demands. It was a victory, but Aaliyah knew it was only the first step. As she exited the building, the protesters outside erupted into cheers. Aaliyah paused at the top of the steps, her eyes scanning the crowd. She saw faces of every age, race, and background, each one a testament to the power of collective action. Carolyn met her at the bottom of the steps, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. You did it, she said. They agreed. For now, Aaliyah replied. But this isn't over. They'll fight back the moment the pressure eases. Then we keep the pressure on, Carolyn said firmly. Aaliyah nodded, her resolve hardening. We have to. For them. She gestured toward the crowd, her voice thick with emotion. For everyone who's ever been silenced. That evening, Aaliyah sat in her apartment, the weight of the day pressing down on her. She picked up her phone and opened an email from Maria Alvarez, the flight attendant who had written to her before. This time, the subject line read, "Thank you, Ms. Monroe." The email began, "I saw the news today. For the first time in my career, I feel like things might actually change. I just wanted you to know how much this means to me and to so many others. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all of us. And we're with you. Tears filled Aaliyah's eyes as she read the words. She closed the email and sat back, staring out at the city lights. The road ahead was long, and the challenges were far from over. But for the first time, she felt the tide beginning to turn. The cracks in the system were widening, and the walls were starting to fall. Aaliyah Monroe had sparked a movement, and there was no turning back now. The rain fell in a steady rhythm as Aaliyah Monroe stood on the balcony of her apartment, watching the city shimmer under the glow of streetlights. It had been weeks since the board meeting. Weeks of relentless work, sleepless nights, and unyielding pressure. But tonight, for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to pause. Inside, her phone buzzed with messages: congratulations, updates, requests for interviews. The airline had publicly announced the implementation of the reforms she had fought for: independent oversight, diversity benchmarks, transparent complaint processes, and a scholarship program for underrepresented groups aspiring to enter the aviation industry. It was a victory, but Aaliyah knew it wasn't the end. It was a beginning. Carolyn arrived, shaking off her umbrella as she stepped inside. "It's official," she said, holding up her phone. The airline just released the final audit results, along with a statement committing to all the reforms. "And the reaction?" Aaliyah asked, her voice calm but her heart pounding. "Overwhelmingly positive," Carolyn replied. "Employees are sharing their stories, praising the changes. Customers are responding, too." "But," she hesitated. "But what?" Aaliyah pressed. Carolyn sighed. "There's still backlash. Some executives have resigned in protest, claiming the reforms are excessive. And a few media outlets are spinning it as a power grab on your part." Aaliyah smiled faintly, the kind of smile born from exhaustion rather than amusement. "Let them. The truth is out there now. They can't put it back in the box." Later that evening, Aaliyah attended a town hall meeting organized by the airline employees. The room was packed, the energy electric. Maria Alvarez, the flight attendant whose emails had become a source of strength for Aaliyah, stood at the front, addressing the crowd. "For years, we were told to keep our heads down, to accept things as they were," Maria said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But now, thanks to this movement, we've found our voices, and we're not going back." The room erupted into applause, and Aaliyah felt a lump rise in her throat. When Maria gestured for her to come forward, she hesitated for a moment before stepping onto the stage. As she faced the crowd, Aaliyah's heart swelled with the enormity of the moment. "This isn't about me," she began, her voice steady. "It's about us. It's about the people who refused to stay silent, who demanded better, who believed that change was possible." She paused, her eyes scanning the sea of faces. "The work isn't done. It won't be done for a long time. But what we've accomplished here proves something powerful. When we stand together, we can break down even the strongest walls." The applause was deafening, the sound reverberating through the room like a heartbeat. In the days that followed, the ripple effects of Aaliyah's fight began to spread. Other companies announced their own audits and reform initiatives. Industry leaders reached out to her for guidance, seeking to replicate the changes she had forced at the airline. The movement was no longer just hers, it belonged to everyone who had dared to believe in something better. One evening, Marcus called. His voice was warm, tinged with pride. "You've done something incredible, Aaliyah. You didn't just change a company, you changed an industry." "I couldn't have done it alone," she replied. "And it's not over." "No," Marcus said, "but you've shown us the way forward." On a bright, crisp morning, Aaliyah attended the launch of the airline's scholarship program. The event was held in a large hangar, transformed into a celebration of opportunity and progress. Rows of aspiring pilots and aviation professionals filled the space, their faces alight with hope. Thomas Grayson, now a subdued and humbled version of the man she had once sparred with, approached her. "Ms. Monroe," he said, extending a hand, "I owe you an apology. And a thank you." Aaliyah shook his hand, her expression measured. "It's not about me, Mr. Grayson. It's about doing what's right." As the event concluded, a young woman approached Aaliyah, her hands trembling slightly as she held out a small pin in the shape of an airplane. "Miss Monroe," she said, her voice soft, "I wanted to thank you. You've given me and so many others a chance we never thought we'd have." Aaliyah accepted the pin, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You earned it," she said, "and now it's your turn to lead." That night, as Aaliyah returned home, she sat by her window, the city stretching out before her like an endless sea of possibilities. The battle had been hard fought, and the road ahead remained uncertain. But for the first time, she felt the weight lift slightly, replaced by quiet, unshakable determination. The system hadn't just cracked, it had begun to shift. And Aaliyah Monroe, with the support of countless others, had proven that change wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. As the rain began to fall again, Aaliyah smiled, her reflection merging with the city lights. The horizon was no longer a distant dream, it was a promise. And she was ready to keep building it, one step at a time.